You're listening to the Nerd to Know Media Network. Welcome to the Metal Dialogues.
Hello everybody, welcome to Nerd to Know Media here on nerdtoknowmedia.com, Spotify, YouTube, Twitch, all that good stuff. We are everywhere, and of course you can reach out nerdtoknowmedia@gmail.com or comment below or whatever. We are not hard to find. We have so many great shows that, as it is, that I was hesitant about launching another one. However, once circumstances around this guest happened, I realised from the dark isn't going to do it. I'm going to have to do a metal podcast. Now look, I'm okay with that, but there's so many great metal podcasts from Ireland already. Metal Cell, you know, Carl's podcast, King Woe's Court, From the Depths, Dial M for Metal, Put the Metal On, Cranium and Titanium. You're absolutely stocked for metal podcasts, and they're all great. I enjoy them. I've been on a bunch of them. I love being on them. A few I haven't been on. Look, hopefully I'll be on them one day. But, you know, I didn't want to do my own metal podcast. The lads have it covered. However, I had to for this. And it got me thinking, well, what's a different way to do it? The metal dialogues. Well, instead of coming at it going, right, well, you know, we'll have this person in from the band to talk about what's going on. It's more kind of like, well, an overall topic of metal in general. You know, and this one sums up my mission statement for this podcast. Dr. Jeremy J. Swist at heavymetalclassicist. Follow me on Twitter. I checked out some of his stuff on heavymetalclassicist.home.blog, and it's great. He breaks down classics in metal through different lenses, through different periods, through different themes. So Iron Maiden, Sabaton, a lot of folk metal, a lot of power metal, loads of power metal, all kind of done through this, and some black metal as well, through this lens. And if you guys don't know what classics is, it's the study of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Now that's my background. I spent way too much time studying classics in college, and it's very rare that you get that overlap. You know, I can count on two fingers the people who like metal and classics, in my experience, one of which is still a very good friend of mine. However, if you're a Horrenda fan or an Otis fan, you know, you would have seen my own use of that in artwork or song titles or anything, or even the name Otis, that's a reference to the Odyssey, you know. So I had to jump on this opportunity to interview this guy. And I can honestly say it's one of the best interviews I've ever done, one of the most exciting interviews I've ever done, and one of the weirdest conversations I've ever had, because I've never had an hour-long conversation with someone who knows so much about metal and so much about classics at the same time. And he pretty much said the exact same thing, and that's a huge honor for me as well. So, you know, I didn't want to do a metal podcast of my own, but I am happy that it's here. Now, going forward, will there be other shows? Maybe. But all I can say now is check out this show. It's absolutely rad. I'm really happy that we got to do it. I'm really happy to present it to you guys. But look, subscribe. Or better again, email us. nerdtoknowmedia@gmail.com with your ideas. If you're in a band, if you're a metalhead, cool, man. Or women, of course. You know, you're welcome. Everyone's welcome. Email me. You want to come on the show? Cool. Let's set it up, you know. That's what the Metal Dialogues is all about. It is about these great conversations about metal, and here is one coming up right now. Dr. Jeremy J. Swist, the Metal Classicist. Here we go on the Metal Dialogues. Alright everybody, welcome back to the show. Thank you very much for joining us here on the channel, of course, nerdtoknowmedia.com. I'm very blown away by having this particular guest on with me today. As you guys know, ancient history is kind of a love of mine, so it's my honor and privilege to have Dr. Jeremy J. Swist, the metalhead classicist, or heavy metal classicist himself. Welcome to the show, sir. It's a great honor.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
No worries, no worries. It's weird, right? Because like I have a lot of friends who are classicists and metalheads, but that kind of that coming together is less common than you would think. Surprisingly, it's what kind of got you into the. Well, first of all, how long have you been a metalhead, and what got you into that? And then we'll talk about how you ended up looking at classics.
Well, I'm in my early 30s now, and I got into metal around the start of high school, so 2002, 2003, thereabouts. And interestingly enough, I got into metal around the same time that I started taking Latin classes in high school.
Right.
And so from an early point, kind of the two things coincided more closely than for a lot of other people. And from time to time, I saw how they combined, but it wasn't really until I got to grad school in classics that I started realizing that there's some potential here for research,
Mm.
as I discovered that it wasn't just an anomaly that some bands, like Iron Maiden or Manila Road or others, started singing songs about ancient history and mythology. But, if you go on Metal Archives and you type in Rome or,
Mm.
Achilles or Medusa into the advanced search, you'll get hundreds and thousands of songs that deal with all sorts of topics from antiquity, battles, and philosophy and poetry and all sorts of topics from Greece and Rome and Egypt and Mesopotamia and all those traditions. It's quite rich, and so and I'm not the only person who does this, and
Yeah.
I'm not the first. And I want to make sure people know that the people who laid the groundwork for kind of the scholarly study of this phenomenon were Chris Fletcher at Louisiana State University and Osman Umarhan at the University of New Mexico. They really got the ball going on this with, they had a conference panel, at one point, and then that became the basis for an edited volume that they published last year called Classical Antiquity and Heavy Metal Music.
Mm.
Is quite excellent. It brings together scholars from, throughout North America and Europe, looking at different aspects of heavy metal and the ancient world. So.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to check that out. It seems like a pretty good read. One of the advantages of still being in college is I get access to journals again, so I'll have to give that a read. It's fun. But before we get into that in a bit more depth, you said that you were a kid about the same age as myself. When I think we actually are very similar in age, but when we kind of got into metal, and that was an interesting time to be a metalhead in particular, because like it was like the rise of like new metal, and then you had like the kind of gatekeeping in from like Limp Bizkit to like Iron Maiden, Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, all that kind of stuff, and then it just goes darker and deeper. Was that your experience as well, or like, because obviously I didn't start learning Latin until I was in college. I started it during my master's, so I didn't go to college initially. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I just ended up in classics. So it's a little bit different there. So I was only kind of became aware of these themes and these tropes a lot later on. So I guess my question is more kind of like, was your interest in one spurred by the other, and did that lead your path? Because like but black metal bands deal with it, death metal bands deal with it, but like 9 times out of 10, like it's power metal or heavy metal bands that kind of go this road, and like Iron Maiden is the prime example of it. But you have bands like Sabaton, that's the whole career, as well as just these historical pieces. Symphony X as well, the artwork for Symphony X, obviously, and the album The Odyssey was unlike anything I heard before when I got to check that out. So did that kind of influence your taste, or was it just you liked what you like and you just picked and choose what kind of ding that bell for you?
So you're basically asking, if a metal band engages with antiquity, does that make me more likely to like it?
Yeah.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
my favorite, my top 10 favorite bands are, I think only one of them, Manila Road, has any music to do with antiquity, and they put out quite a bit of it. But besides that, I didn't really let that dictate my taste. I prioritized, whether the music sounded good to me. And, when I was, I did do the new metal route around that time, and, eventually, got into Slayer, and it went from there. But,
that's usually what happens. You find Slayer and then it goes deeper.
But, also very quickly, I got into black metal, especially symphonic black metal, because I was raised on classical music.
Yeah.
And like my father's a pipe organist. And so like, that was the stuff that I guess really resonated with me the most. For a long time, it was just it seemed more of a novelty, when a band just happened to, sing about Greece or Rome. And I liked it, like, one of my favorite bands is Aborum from Italy, and they have this song called Roma Divina Urbs, about, it's a song about basically the ancient Roman spirit, rising from the depths of hell and overthrowing the Catholic Church and reestablishing, Roman glory in Italy and all of that. And so it's just a really cool song. And I was like, and I, at the time I thought, this is, I wish more bands did this, but the thing is, I just wasn't looking in the right places at the time.
And obviously the internet has kind of like blown that up now as well, where like, you can go to Metal Archives and you can type in whatever you want and be like, any genre you can think of, any topic you can think of, it's there, so that is pretty cool in and of itself. It's weird. That's a weird like concept for me, that band, because it's like Catholic Church is Rome. It's weird. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. But yeah, look, you have a lot of work. Obviously, the stuff that's up on the website, heavymetalclassicist.home.blog, and your research interests are pretty cool as well. Like outside just the music stuff, Imperial Greece and Roman historiography, and then classic reception and heavy metal music. Why did you go? And I have to ask this: late antiquity. What drew you to late antiquity over just sticking with the imperial period?
Probably because when I was studying classics in undergrad, it kind of popped out to me as this sort of novel thing that not as many classicists or ancient historians were interested in or working on.
Right.
So when you think of classical Greece and Rome, classical Greece is 5th century Athens roughly, and classical Rome is around the 1st century BCE CE, around the Augustan age, and then late antiquity, the later Roman Empire had traditionally been sort of maligned as this period of decline, and the literature is all derivative, and the government had become had suppressed free thought and all of that with the rise of Christianity and everything, and those. I think I think Edward Gibbon had a lot to do with sort of, and just the Enlightenment in general had a lot to do with kind of entrenching those attitudes toward, the later Roman Empire, early Middle Ages, this concept of the Dark Ages and everything, and the fall of Rome was the fall of civilization. And so, but it turns out that if you look, late antiquity is just a fascinating period, because it's like, it really sort of explodes the notion that there was this clean break between the ancient world and the medieval world. There was this period of, transition where these kind of new ideas were coming in and interacting with old ideas in these new and interesting combinations. I feel like it's a very relevant period, because suddenly you have institutions like the Christian Church, interacting with elements of pagan antiquity, sometimes in cooperative ways, sometimes in antagonistic ways. And so I got very interested in kind of that period of transition, especially the 4th century, which was the century, where we had Constantine and basically, the church coming to power and Christianization of the empire.
Yeah.
And so within that period, I particularly became interested in the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate.
Yeah.
As this emperor who, he was in the house of Constantine and he came to the throne, and then suddenly he said, oh, by the way, I'm not Christian. We're going to try to bring paganism back and go back to the good old days of Roman glory and, religion this Christianity thing is just is an aberration, and it's going to lead us down the wrong path. But one of the great what ifs of history, because he only reigned for 18 months before he died in battle, and then they went back to Christianity after that.
It's funny you mentioned Julian the Apostate. I actually recently got a good book called The Last Pagan
Yep.
on it. Just on my Kindle randomly. So I've been trying to catch up on some of the reading. And it's actually a fairly decent book. It's not long out as well, so it's funny you mention that. But no, that's a fair point. I think on that, like, you hit the nail on the head. City of God as well. I think with St. Augustine, a lot of that has got to do with the derivative, where that is just like, I always refer to it as like a diss rap of like taking fragments we have and then just kind of slapping them down. But so yeah, when you're going into late antiquity, like, where would it stop for you? Would it go into the barbarians when Rome was broken up with the Lombards, or with the Goths and stuff like that, or where would you see a clean break into it? Or, as you said, is it just kind of a case where there is no clean break? It's just changes and transforms into something else.
I mean, and that's the thing about late antiquity, is its very existence, challenges our notion of, these traditional periodizations. So, for instance, there's so much disagreement over where late antiquity not only ends but also begins.
Right.
Usually, there's a bit more consensus on where it begins. Usually, they draw the line somewhere in the 3rd century. They kind of use the period of anarchy and just economic and political crises in the 3rd century of the Roman Empire as sort of this this transitional period before you have the rise of Diocletian and Constantine and the Tetrarchy, and sort of a complete overhaul of the Roman government to become a model that resembles more closely, the kingdoms of the Middle Ages and those sorts of, absolute governments with large bureaucracies and everything. So somewhere in the middle of the 3rd century would probably be where it begins. Where it ends, that also depends on, where. It's not just a question of when, because, the Western Empire, yes, 476 is when, the last Roman emperor in the West was deposed. But it's not just like everything just stopped. The Goths were in charge, for several decades. But a lot of things went, for people in Italy, at least, it was business as usual.
Yeah.
And then what really messed things up was actually the Gothic Wars, when the Eastern Romans under Justinian, came over and tried to take Italy back, and there was just all this back and forth, and that just sort of just completely wrecked the place.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny in that sense. As I said, like,
you could see late antiquity maybe ending in by the year 600 in the West, and that's not. Right. And that's kind of close to where you might say it ends in the East, because, I think a lot of people, including myself, will draw the line at the Arab invasions in the East in the 7th century.
Yeah.
But some people go as far as, the 800s, sort of long view of late antiquity.
Okay.
But again, it's just, these periods are arbitrary. There's no, sudden cataclysmic, seismic shift, that you can pin down on any particular year or something like that.
It's funny, like
History is a lot messier than that.
it's funny. Like I always say to people, I think one of the biggest problem with when people are looking at history in general, they kind of see it as you said, like delineated periods, or like this happened and this happened and this happened. I always say it's kind of like a TV where you're flicking around, and these things are happening at the same time, and they're intersecting, and that's probably a better way to look at it, because like even to our own time as well, like we're aware of what happened in the 80s, and stuff might come back into vogue.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean they're gone. We don't just forget about it and say we're not going back there, or the 70s or whatever. And even with something like metal, like how often do we get like a black metal resurgence or a thrash metal resurgence, and it turns into something new? So yeah, I think that's a very good way to look at it. But I'm gonna have to reassess my opinion on late antiquity, because to be fair, it's like the Hellenistic period. It's a blank spot for me for the most part, because I'm like, yeah, I just don't look at it. But that's pretty cool. Okay, so let's kind of get into the meat and potatoes here of some of the work. Like on your blog, there's some really good pieces. I love the Odyssey. A friend of mine, actually, she's just like, Dara, listen, I want to read classics. Where do I start? And I'm like, oh wow, no one's asked me this in a while. So here's a few things to go at. And I'm like, obviously, the epic cycle, a few bits from Rome, and she's working her way through the Iliad now. And I'm like, well, give it time. The Odyssey is a much better read. And I think for everybody, it's like one of the most accessible pieces to read, because I remember my classics professor being like, oh, the Iliad's a bit tough because it's kind of boring, but the Odyssey's a thumping good read. His words, not mine. And I'm like, it 100% is. Out of all of them, and by them I mean classic themes of writing, and even into like other stuff, even the Simpsons have done episodes on the Odyssey. Why do you think the Odyssey is so relevant and prevalent today?
That's a great question. I mean, there's so much in that poem. All I can think of is certain reasons why it might be preferred to the Iliad, though I personally prefer the Iliad.
Really?
I think the Iliad deals more with reality.
Fair.
There's a lot of kind of tough existential questions that are presented in that text that I feel just really resonate. Questions of the nature of heroism, on human mortality, one's duty to the collective, versus their own self-interest. What's our relationship to to the gods, and just the world that the gods have control in the Iliad, they're not, the Abrahamic God, they're not moral beings. They're these kind of selfish, violent, petulant, very powerful beings that, they play favorites, with certain humans, but, otherwise they just see this whole Trojan War thing as just this game, from that perspective. And that sort of, tells you that, there's an inherent absurdity in us, just killing each other over, things like honor or even, conquest and everything. Because, the gods can't die. They can bleed, they can get hurt, but ultimately, this is just a game. When they battle each other or on outside of Troy, it's just Ares or Athena will get a spear to the gut, and then they'll pull it out. They'll it'll hurt, but they'll live. For the humans fighting, this is it's terminal. This is kind of what defines us. So, I know you asked about the Odyssey, but I had to approach it.
No, to be fair,
I had to do my piece on the Iliad just to explain my own preference for it.
No, it's fair. It's fair.
And I think I think the Iliad also just has more resonance with with certain genres of metal in that regard, because I think it's just darker.
But see, that's kind of what I'm getting at. That's exactly what I'm getting at. It's like for me, my personal favorite of all of them is the Aeneid, because I love Augustus, right? And it's proper just fan fiction, Augustan propaganda. So I like the way it's remixed, and it's kind of has the best of both for me. But most people don't know that exists. Most people are aware of the Trojan War, but they probably haven't read it. But for some reason, the Odyssey just has this kind of overarching appeal that kind of dwarfs anything else. And I'm just kind of always taken back by that, because going into the Iliad or whatever, as you said, it has those darker themes, and the Odyssey kind of is just a kind of a drunken romp through the ancient world, But why do you think those themes aren't picked up in metal, which is darker? But Symphony X will go and do a a concept album on the Odyssey, right?
I mean, the Iliad and the Odyssey are certainly, picked up by metal bands across the spectrum, for all very good reasons. And I mean, with the Odyssey, whereas the Iliad is sort of decentered, like, yes, it's about Achilles, but it's about so many other people, and this is sort of a clash of armies and the clash of the gods and everything. Whereas the Odyssey, and I think the resonance of the Odyssey, especially for heavy metal, but certainly for others, is, the first word of the Odyssey is Andra, okay? The man. Okay, mostly about focuses on an individual, okay, and story revolves around him. So even when he's not actually in the narrative in certain parts of it, it's everybody's talking about him. And one thing. And early on, since classicists have been looking at this, this heavy metal and classics phenomenon, have quickly picked up on the idea that heavy metal, especially power metal and traditional heavy metal, but other genres, it's a form of escapism,
Right.
In which which is often implies sort of contempt for, or just alienation from, or just a rejection of modernity, industrialized capitalist society, and they want to escape to some sort of romanticized past. Whether it be a mythical past or a realm of fantasy, or fantasy literature specifically, often, or ancient history, and so. The Odyssey, is certainly provides that sort of fantastic adventure, and I think there's just more elements of folktale and of fantasy there. Robert E. Howard type stuff, or Tolkien sort of adventure where it's not just constant warfare.
So you think it's kind of in the same way that I suppose black metal bands traditionally would use Tolkien, for example, where he's pretty much like the central pillar of that genre, or even bands like Amon Amarth, who are all about all things Nordic mythology. You think that's why they use it, because they can kind of have that realm of escapism without focusing purely on these big themes of humans as gods playthings, basically, or something like that, or the folly of war.
Yeah, and and so in addition to this escape, or this seeking of this anti-modernity here, another big focus is masculinity. Okay, right. And you see this in album covers like Eternal Champion and Manowar, and others, where they kind of idolize these supermen. Okay, these muscle-bound, sword-wielding Conan the Barbarian figures.
The traditional Greek heroic.
Yeah, and so so a Greek hero like Odysseus, Achilles, Heracles, etc., Aeneas, even. It's pretty easy to to shift to looking at that type of hero, as someone who through strength of not just body but also of mind, you know, faces these challenges, you know, reclaims their homelands like Odysseus does, and also resists temptations as sort of a way of proving their masculinity. And I think what one appeal of the Odyssey for a lot of heavy metal bands is it's not just a way to present a model of the ideal man, the ideal warrior that they want to embody in their music, but also there's several feminine figures in
Yes.
the Odyssey that you have much less of in the Iliad. Okay,
Yeah.
in the Iliad, you know, the women are basically, you know, wives or mistresses or slave women who are rather passive and don't get a lot of airtime, and they're really overshadowed by the men. Whereas in the Odyssey, you have very powerful women. Okay? You know, Penelope is, you know, a match for Odysseus in her intelligence and strategy, though in heavy metal, you tend not to see that side of her too much. She's more of the damsel in distress who has to be saved at the end. But,
which is funny because she kind of saves herself in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you, in the Odyssey, you also have figures such as Circe,
Yep.
Calypso, such as the Sirens.
Yep. Absolutely.
And as foils, as contrasts to this hyper-masculine hero, these are what I would call heavy metal femme fatale.
I like that.
So they basically they present women, powerful women, as dangerous and a threat to the hero because they threaten his. They essentially threaten his patriarchal dominion in some way, often through sexual temptation.
Yeah, which is very much the case when he's on the island with
exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And so they you know, so for instance in the Odyssey, you know, when Odysseus you know, comes to Circe's island, Hermes shows up and is like, before you go see Circe, you have to, you know, take this charm so she doesn't turn you into a pig, and then you have to draw your sword at her and make her swear an oath that you know, she'll do you no harm because she might emasculate you, okay? Because she represents that threat to male power, by being not just a powerful and magical sorceress, but also a fiercely independent woman, somebody who exists outside of human society, okay, outside of the patriarchal civilization, okay, which is why a lot of these witches and goddesses and monsters in the Odyssey represent untamed civilization.
Yeah,
okay?
it's that kind of, it's that othering of different cultures. And it's funny that you mention it as well, because like a lot of bands that would do that would be kind of, you know, criticized sometimes for having that view. But do you think it's less of a case of they have that view and like they're just out going out of their way to put that into their music, or it's just like it's just part of who they are and they're reclaiming parts of this in this story that they're able to identify with based on where they're from?
Definitely. Yeah, and then, you know, the other aspect, you know, that fuels a lot of this reception is, you know, heritage. You know, so, you know, preponderance of Greek and Italian bands will, you know, be singing these songs, you know, because they feel that there's this national connection to it. But, you know, also just, you know, bands in the Western world in general, you know, will also tap into this as kind of the cultural heritage of what they would call Western civilization. You know, this is, you know, based on the literature of Greece and Rome, which is, you know, a concept that, you know, is now being rightly challenged, you know, because it can lead to kind of this idea of European chauvinism.
Right.
You know, we have the superior civilization and the superior literature because it's the classics, you know, as it's
Yeah.
called. But you know, but that also is what makes these texts very attractive to these bands, because they represent this heritage that they feel is being sidelined in the modern day due to the forces of globalism and multiculturalism, immigration, you know, Marxism, if what you will.
Well, yeah,
And
like to be fair, I can empathize with that. Like a lot of what I've done myself would come from that rejection of modernity in that sense, you know, and you know, it wasn't something intentional. It's more just kind of like, you know, instead of going for these wider topics and actually working in, aesthetics are a big thing. And I do see that a lot on black metal. Norgoroth do it as well, and Marduk and stuff like that as well, where it's just like you will use these aesthetics of the past to kind of draw for them, or I use stuff in parallel. So yeah, I actually 100% do get that. It comes from that sense of, well, yeah, it's the classics and it's our Western civilization. It's our kind of shared heritage, and more kind of just going through and rediscovering it. But the Irish have done that for a while, like even going back to Ulysses, you know, that all comes from the same tradition. So I'm not saying that that's what we're doing, but we've always kind of done this, you know, every couple of 100 years, it cycles itself back where you're like, right, let's look back to look for, even Livy, you know, that's why he wrote his History of Rome, because he hated his current time, you know?
Yeah.
So,
And yeah, you see this a lot. You know, Livy is part of, you know, the Augustan project of, you know, going back to good old fashioned Roman values. You know,
yep.
This is how we were when Rome was founded, and this is how we should be again. You know, dare I say, you know, he had the message of, you know, make Rome great again, you know, but, you know, and Livy certainly had his own, you know, independent ideas, and it wasn't just Augustan propaganda, but he certainly wrote, you know, his history, you know, in order to express definitely plenty of distaste for the present, because he began writing the thing, you know, when the civil wars were still, you know, smoldering.
Yeah.
And, you know, he didn't finish it until, you know, a little after Augustus died, but, you know, it took a while. And the thing I want to make clear here, though, is, you know, heavy metal and its kind of just fundamental rejection of modernity, you know, does not necessarily imply any sort of political ideology on either side of the spectrum, you know,
Yeah,
because
no,
people on
absolutely.
the right and people on the left, and you know, reject, you know, aspects of, you know, contemporary society, you know, just as much. And so
For
that's
sure.
why I see heavy metal as, you know, yes, it's political, but it is, you know, it is not inherently left or right. It's simply a way to oppose or challenge or rebel against some aspect of society.
Yeah.
Okay? You know, whether in whatever direction you take that rejection is, you know, is further along, and that is something that you add to it, but it's not something that is inherent to metal, you know, right wing, left wing, etc. Despite what you know, some people might say these days, you know, when we have the rise of you know, red anarchist or, you know, left-wing black metal bands, for instance, you know, there's been a lot, you know, those are rising in popularity, and there's been a lot of resistance to that by people within the metal scene, because they're like, oh, you know, politics doesn't belong in metal, or you know, metal is fundamental, especially black metal and that stuff is, you know, this
It's
is,
above it. It's
yeah, it's
above
above
it.
it. You know, black metal is supposed to be this elitist, you know, misanthropic, you know, and just conservative genre where we're supposed to go back to, you know, the old pagan ways, and of course that can lead them down the path ideologically toward fascism and all forms of,
which which to be
so
fair, yeah,
yeah.
look, it's a thing that if we didn't talk about it, it would be remiss to talk about it. But you know, I would say as somebody who is a center libertarian in lots of ways, for me, I'm like, and most of the lads in the band are the same in the Irish metal scene, which is my direct connection to this.
Mhm.
I know communists. I know people who would be called other things, Satanists, whatever, and we don't care. We're like, hey man, what's your tune like? What's your riff like? You know what I mean? And that's what's great about metal. I think it does get the reputation of being elitist, but it's also very inclusive in that sense. Like it's like, oh well, you're judged more about the music you like rather than who you are. You know what I mean? It's just like, wait, what do you mean you like that? And that's kind of the gatekeeping thing. That's the old joke, But yeah, unpacking this kind of stuff comes with that danger. But I don't know. With the classics, even learning it as well, I'm amazed there isn't that crossover, because like you go in and we're all nerds, so it is what it is. But when you're in there and you meet a lot of people who would maybe do a couple of modules in classics, and they would probably be into metal as well. And when you kind of dig in, you're like, how are you not more connected to this? Why is it not? And I don't know if what's like in the States or in Canada, but in Ireland, it's very much like, once you find it, it's like this great secret. You know what I mean? It's almost like you're discovering metal for the first time. And that's kind of what it was like for me, where I'm just like, I went to college, found this kind of stuff, and I was like, oh, wow, this is great. And it was like discovering Slayer for the first time. What's it like over there for you guys? Is it open? Is there like an open market for it? Or is it kind of like its own little, you're walking into a metal club?
So yeah, and certainly, as I've been doing this stuff for a while, living in these two worlds that are now coming closer together for me all the time, seeing these just sort of striking parallels between the culture of classics, which is not just the academic discipline, but also just, how people in society engage with it. But also, and the parallels with heavy metal. So for instance, I need to write this sometime, comparing an academic conference to a heavy metal festival.
I can see a lot of parallels. I really can.
Because it's a space where like-minded people who have a shared knowledge of the scene / field, which both have a canon of works. So we have a canon of classical literature, and then we have, a canon of bands that, people in the scene are expected to at least know about.
Right.
And then in both fields, there is these sort of practices of gatekeeping where, you have the elitists or the know-it-alls who, only interact with the people who, really know their stuff. And there's also, the usual, there's sexism and racism that enforces, these sort of hierarchies that form as well. And I think both classics and metal as fields / scenes are having that sort of introspection in order to make themselves more inclusive and sort of deconstructs these sort of hierarchies.
Which is good. It's good. It's goodness. Like
Yeah.
I've seen that kind of happen now. Obviously, I'm not in the classic scene as much, but anyone who I've talked to who still is in it, well, would be kind of saying the same thing. And particularly in metal as well, you've seen a lot more things which you never would see normally, which are becoming more normal, which is great. Like a lot more female bands, a lot more women getting into the scene, and just performing, which is always great to see, because you're like, why wasn't this happening before? And as you said, it's because of the gatekeeping, the sexism, all that kind of stuff as well. And luckily that's all kind of gone away. But on that point, I do kind of want to switch gears into one more topic, which I have to talk about before, because I'm just conscious of the time. Greek tragedy, right? Now, Rome is my thing, right? I love Rome, but I am kind of obsessed with Oedipus Rex, right? As far as like, we're doing a music video at the moment, and literally I don't know if you've seen the BBC production, the 1957 production of Oedipus Rex with the weird masks. like the crazy elongated masks?
I'm familiar. I've seen the pictures, but I haven't seen the production.
It's good. It's very good. And I'm like, hey, what I've mainly used classics nowadays for is, hey guys, I have ideas for either song titles or aesthetics. That's what my classic education gets me nowadays. But you know, so I do have kind of a low-key obsession with that, right? So when I saw that you had done a series on Greek drama and tragedy, how common is that, and what basically why is it not more kind of dug into? Because it is such an important thing. Like, we all, most people know the stories, or at least know some of the characters in them. They might not know why they know them, but they know them. And what I was struck by was how limited it was, how small the scope was. Because I would imagine, like, you know, it's ample ground for gothic metal, for depressive suicidal black metal, and like dungeon metal. Like, it's designed for that, right? But why is it such a limited window? And what was your experience kind of going through each of the three biggies to kind of make those articles?
Yeah, the three biggies: Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great thing to talk about, which I don't really address in those pieces. You know, there is a very limited reception of Greek tragedy in heavy metal. There are some prominent things, like, for instance, you know, Virgin Steel's House of Atreus double album, you know, from Aeschylus's Oresteia, you know, is one of the, you know, landmark foundational. It was one of the first just concept albums that adapted classical literature, you know, entirely. Before that, you had kind of one-off songs, you know, like Flight of Icarus and all that.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's that, but it didn't, and that perhaps set the trend for, you know, adapting classical literature to whole albums. But you don't really see a lot of tragedies adapted that way. You bring up Gothic metal, and so you know, where there is more of, and Gothic metal, symphonic metal, and combinations thereof. You know, those are genres where you have you more often have women musicians and vocalists and songwriters.
And that's why I think it'd be
lyricists. And so that's why, for instance, with Euripides, you have songs about Medea and the play The Medea.
That's it. And like, again, like, you know, I remember a lot of women in my class would always go to Medea. It's a very obviously it's a very female centric thing, but it just seems to resonate actually pretty much in the same way that, like, as you said, the manly Odysseus thing resonates with men. Medea seems to do the exact same thing for women.
Absolutely, and she's definitely one of the most popular women figures in the classical world. You know, adapted into heavy metal, because, you know, she personifies, you know, just this feminine rage against, you know,
being wronged.
Patriarchal oppression and all of that.
Yeah.
That sort of leads to, I think, the reason why there's so little reception of tragedy is it has to do with the genre of tragedy itself.
Right.
Epic literature, you know, Iliad, Odyssey, Aeneid, you know, you have all of these grand battles and just world-changing events. You have just heroic journeys. You have you know, gods, divine intervention, and you have all of this, all these grand narratives. Whereas a tragedy, you know, if we go by Aristotle here, he says, you know, a proper tragedy has to take place within a single day. It has to take place in one spot, usually.
Okay.
And so it's a very limited kind of story, and it's a story that, rather than addressing great battles and quests, it takes place in a city or even within a household. Okay, and it deals with issues that are more, have to do rather with individual families, and also these are stories in which women figure more prominently.
Yeah.
like Clytemnestra, like Antigone, like Medea, like Phaedra, etc. Okay, and so these are very compelling characters to write about. And as you saw in those pieces, there are songs, there are bands that write about Antigone and Clytemnestra, and certainly Medea and others, and they do a great job with that. But but not a lot of bands pick up on that, partly because there's probably there's still not as much feminine representation in metal to kind of pick up on those stories.
But do you think as well that, like, going forward, it will kind of be like all I can think is like the dam breaking, where you're digging down and you're hitting these layers, and you kind of, like, even now, like, when I was trying to explain to people who aren't into metal, that there's a genre of metal for everything, literally. And they're like, no way, what do you mean? I'm like, if you name it, there's probably a genre that's about it. And I think this becoming more common. And again, I was only like, it never intersected really with me as much until I start digging into it and reading the work. I'm like, wow, this is beyond just what even I was exposed to as both someone in a band and a classicist and a metalhead. Even for me, it's like, oh, wow, there is this whole other side of things. So I think if more bands kind of dig into it, do you think they will kind of get down somewhere even as obscure as like Seven Against Thieves or something like that, where they start writing songs about that? Do you think that's where we're going? Or will it be kind of what we see with, Amon Amarth, where it's like, or even, it's the same as happened with Irish mythology as well. Like, very few bands are starting to do it, but more bands, and even some of the lads that I know, we're all starting to kind of work that in because it hasn't been done before. Do you think that's where we're going, or is this kind of being phased out?
That's a great question. And I think the thing to keep in mind is there is a strong correlation between the rise in this phenomenon of what I'd call heavy metal classicism and the resurgence of interest in antiquity in the greater pop culture. Right?
Okay, right.
So, in other words, you have just a few dozen songs, okay, from the 80s, and even fewer from the 90s, dealing with this topic, partly because just the changes in the genre of metal, kind of the ups and downs. But past 2000, this is when things really start to take off, with bands suddenly becoming interested in the classics. And I think there's a strong correlation between that and the premiere of movies such as Gladiator, such as Troy, such as 300, and Kingdom of Heaven for the medieval reception, Alexander, so I think they sort of took their cues from pop culture and worked with that. And I think metal, I think, has done that since the beginning. Yeah. So Black Sabbath, for instance, they named their band after a 60s horror movie, and they essentially created music that sort of was an extension of that aesthetic of sort of Hammer horror films. And I think just and then in the 80s you had movies like Clash of the Titans, and then you had people these inspired by these sword and sandal flicks from then, taking them and writing songs about it. And so when the classics kind of resurged on the silver screen in the early 2000s, and just this trend continued, then I think that spurred a lot of this kind of creativity, for better or worse. So for instance, one of the most popular topics in ancient history that metal bands write about is the Spartans. Yeah. And especially, the Battle of Thermopylae. And a lot of songs, you can see the direct influence of the film 300.
They watched 300 and that's it.
They watched 300 and wrote a song, and they're reproducing all of the, historical quote unquote inaccuracies, because even Herodotus's quote unquote original version has its own biases and distortions, but
and the flying snakes.
Right. Gold digging ants, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, and this is where another aspect that accounts for this phenomenon is, in this post 9/11 world, or however you want to call it, not trying to be America centric here, but
Right.
there's a rise in nationalist movements,
Okay.
and just sort of this anxiety among more conservative elements in society, and we touched on this before,
Mm.
where certain conservative elements in society are feeling that their these traditional power structures and their culture is under threat due to the migrations and globalism and multiculturalism and all of that, and
Mm.
so they are finding they're finding antiquity, the ancient past, as sort of a way to retrieve that heritage, to some degree, whether if it's just pure escapism, or it's a political ideological impulse there.
So you kind of see it not going anywhere and kind of being explored for better or for worse in that sense.
Yeah, because again, bands of any political, persuasion, can find relevance in this material, and that's what's great about classics
Absolutely.
and ancient history, is that it doesn't belong to any particular people or nation or ideology. It's just there. It's the
Mm.
past. It's a past that has a great influence on the world. It's
Absolutely.
created a lot of things. It's destroyed a lot of things. It's been used to justify a lot of bad things, but it's also been used to, to build things that are quite positive. And so, heavy metal, I feel, is, as a medium that is used to critique the present in its own way, more directly or not, can really take advantage of that material. It's not just, you're not just singing about the past to glorify the past.
No, you're kind of you're taking it as a lens to view the modern world, which is,
Yeah.
you know, again, as somebody who has done it, it's like that's what you do, and I imagine that's what a lot of these other bands are doing. And even when we touch on Irish stuff as well, it is kind of like metaphors. But on that point, right? So I don't know how much you can speak to it, but what's your opinion on bands like Nile, who are taking the Egyptian approach, and then bands like the out in the Islamic world who are doing a very similar thing, but obviously coming at it from a more Middle Eastern standpoint? Have you looked into that? Is that something that interests you? And do you think it is pretty much for the same reason that you said, it's kind of a rejection of what they have now and moving towards their past?
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something I'm actually working on.
Oh, fantastic! We got to stay. We got to stay in touch, man. We got to stay in touch. Yeah,
we will. So I'll first start with kind of bands in the Islamic world.
right.
So, for instance, there is a band. I forget what it's called. I think, is the band called Xerxes, or the song is about Xerxes, but there is a death metal band in Iran who basically look to their pre-Islamic Persian history as a way of rejecting the theocracy that they live under.
Yeah, there's loads of bands like Seeds of Isblis and Anil Mud, and there's some really good bands who are doing that, and it seems to be a thing that's happening there now more and more.
Yeah, and what I love about this band is that it is, a native Iranian/Persian band that is presenting the Persian Empire in a more sympathetic light as this kind of multicultural, inclusive, secular state
Mm.
that it was. Yes, it required people to pay taxes and fight in the army, but
But hey, that happens modern day, right? So, yeah,
but otherwise it was quite tolerant
yeah,
of all sorts of religions
for
because
sure.
it had to in order to be a successful multinational empire.
Mm.
And the Romans had a very similar model.
Absolutely.
Until the Christians came along, and they were a problem because they were intolerant.
Mm.
But anyway, that's a different thing. So I love that bands are doing that, because the problem is if you only have Western bands,
Mm.
singing about the Persian Wars, they're
You only get
going
one.
to
They're going to go for the one side, their side.
they're going
Yeah.
to look at the Persian Empire as this barbarian, orientalized other,
Mm.
as a lot of them do, especially, a lot of bands that sing about Thermopylae tend to, present the Persian Empire as this sort of animalized monolith that is, stands for everything, stands for the opposite of everything that they stand for. But
Mm.
anyway, Egypt is a interesting thing because you don't really have, as far as I can tell, a lot of native Egyptian bands
Mm.
singing about ancient Egypt,
Yeah,
which is surprising.
it is.
There's not that many to begin with, though there are some. Instead, you have Western bands, European bands, North American bands like Nile, okay, from
Mm.
South Carolina. And when they sing about Egypt, they don't sing about Egypt as something that is an extension of themselves.
Mm.
They don't sing about Cleopatra or Nefertiti or Thutmose or Ramses or all of these people as people they identify with.
Right.
And in fact, one of my colleagues, the person I'm actually collaborating on something with, Leire Olavarria, she's an Egyptologist in Birmingham.
Mm.
She wrote a chapter largely on Nile for the classical antiquity and heavy metal volume that I mentioned at the beginning of the.
That's really cool.
Hour.
Yeah, that's cool. I need to definitely go check that out for sure.
And what she does in this chapter is she talks about how heavy metal's reception of Egypt is participating in the discourse of Orientalism,
Really?
where it presents
Okay.
Egypt not as a part of the Western, heritage like Greece and Rome is, but rather as this mysterious other,
Yes.
land of mystery and
Sorcery and
danger, of carnal delights, of this sort of, where you have powerful women like Cleopatra and Nefertiti and Nitocris, who represent these sort of threats to the hierarchy of being and all of that.
right. Huh. I guess I never thought about it that way before, but that's actually what. Yeah.
So yeah, this fascination with Egypt is sort of this exoticizing, kind of fetishizing sort of thing where, Egypt is not part of our heritage. It is something that is separate, that we, we're fascinated with it because it seems so alien to us.
Absolutely. And I think that's, a lot of that's got to do with the modern ancient alien stuff, and also Rome itself by being like, hey, we're not like them, even though we come directly from them in lots of ways as well. It's funny in a sense, but no, definitely, man. Look, I tell you what we're going to do. I've taken up an hour of your time, and I do appreciate it. So I think we'll have to do a follow up on this if you're willing to do so, where we talk about that, because that would be pretty cool.
Yeah, I'd love to. And just one last thing on the ancient alien stuff.
Sure.
That stuff is, that kind of shows kind of this Orientalism where, the Egyptians couldn't possibly have built the pyramids, because, well, why? And the reason is it's pretty much racism. Okay.
Right.
Only white people could have, or Western civilization could have accomplished these feats, and therefore aliens, must have helped them. And the same thing with, the Mayan pyramids and all of that. yeah, so that's kind of the underlying kind of dark underbelly of this Ancient Aliens conspiracy stuff is
Oh, wow.
sort of that bad attitude. So that's just my piece on that. But yes, I would love to come back and chat about more of this stuff. This was a fantastic conversation. Yeah, thanks for having me.
No worries. I've really enjoyed it, man. It's been great. You know, guys, I can't check this out enough. You know, go over to heavymetalclassicist.home.blog. Follow Dr. Jeremy J. Swist on Twitter. The heavy metal classicist. It's been an absolute pleasure, man. This has been great. Any excuse to nerd out about classics and metal is always a lot of fun. So yeah, thank you very much.
All right, have a great night.
All right, guys, thanks so much for checking this edition of the Metal Dialogues. Again, from my preamble at the beginning of the show, I don't know how often these are going to be. If something pops up that I want to talk about, or if some guests want to come on, that's cool too. The rest of the crowd might have something, so no commitment. The best way to stay in contact, if you do like this stuff, is go over to nerdtoknowmedia.com. Like right now, it's all there. All the shows we do up on nerdtoknowmedia.com, also on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, all that good stuff. So if you like what we do here, if you like the show and want to check out more, even just for another one of these shows, go over, check out all the social media, subscribe to the podcast, and, you know, email me, nerdtoknowmedia@gmail.com. what you want to talk about, what you think about this show, if there's any metal topics you want me to talk about, or even any of the guys. You know, we're all, like, there's a lot of us who are metalheads in Nerd to Know Media, so yeah, excited to see how this goes forward. But again, I want to thank you guys for checking this out. I want to send my sincere thanks to Dr. Jeremy J. Swist. Again, check him out. He does loads of podcasts, and you can find the links to it on his Twitter, social media account. It's pretty cool. His Twitter @metalclassicist. Again, that's @metalclassicist. Everything he does, I think he's giving a lecture now on Zoom, which is going to be fun. So do check that out as well if you guys are interested. And again, his website is heavymetalclassicist.home.blog. So again, thank you so much, guys. This has been the first edition of the Metal Dialogues. Talk to you the next show.
Join us at nerdtoknowmedia.com.